The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is one of the most intractable and tragic conflicts in modern history. It is a conflict marked by decades of violence, mistrust, and failed peace attempts. At its heart lies a fundamental clash over land, identity, and security. For Israelis, it is about the right to exist in a Jewish homeland. For Palestinians, it is about self-determination and an end to occupation. This conflict has claimed countless lives, fueled generations of hatred, and left scars on both societies that run deep. The conflict is rooted in the early 20th century, with competing claims to the same territory. The Zionist movement seeking a Jewish state in Palestine, and the Palestinian Arab population resisting displacement clashed repeatedly. The 1948 Arab-Israeli War led to the creation of Israel, but also to the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. This event, known as the Nakba, or catastrophe, remains a central grievance for Palestinians. Subsequent wars in 1967 and 1973 further entrenched Israel's control over the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem, territories that Palestinians claim for their future state. Peace efforts have been intermittent and largely unsuccessful. The Oslo Accords of the 1990s offered a glimmer of hope, but they ultimately failed to resolve the core issues. The rise of Hamas, a Palestinian militant group that controls the Gaza Strip, further complicated the situation. Hamas rejects Israel's right to exist and has engaged in armed struggle against it. The conflict continues to be marked by cycles of violence, with periods of relative calm punctuated by deadly outbreaks. The human cost of this conflict is immeasurable. Thousands of Israelis and Palestinians have been killed, injured, or displaced. The conflict has also had a devastating impact on the economies and infrastructures of both sides. The international community has long been involved in efforts to mediate a lasting peace agreement, but a solution remains elusive. The Israel-Palestinian conflict is a complex and deeply rooted issue with no easy answers. It is a conflict that demands the attention and engagement of the international community if there is to be any hope for a just and lasting peace. The fragile peace that had held since the last major conflict in 2014 was shattered on October 7, 2023. Hamas militants launched a surprise attack on Israel, infiltrating the border and targeting civilians and military installations. The assault, which involved rockets, mortars, and ground incursions, caught Israel off guard and resulted in a significant loss of life. The images that emerged from that day were shocking and horrific. Videos showed Hamas fighters firing on Israeli civilians, including at a music festival near the Gaza border. The death toll quickly climbed, with hundreds of Israelis killed and many more injured. The attack sent shockwaves through Israel, evoking memories of past wars and terrorist attacks. Israel responded swiftly and forcefully to the Hamas offensive. The Israel Defense Forces, IDF, launched airstrikes on targets in Gaza, targeting Hamas military infrastructure as well as the homes of Hamas leaders. The IDF also mobilized ground troops and began massing forces along the Gaza border, preparing for a potential ground invasion. The October 7th attack marked a significant escalation in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It was the deadliest single attack on Israel in its history, surpassing the casualties of the Yom Kippur War in 1973. The attack also shattered the illusion of calm that had prevailed in recent years, demonstrating the enduring volatility of the conflict and the ever-present threat posed by Hamas. In the chaotic aftermath of the October 7th attack, a horrifying new dimension to the conflict emerged: the taking of hostages. Hamas militants, during their incursion into Israel, abducted scores of Israeli civilians, including men, women, and children. These hostages were taken back into Gaza as the fighting raged on, their fate uncertain and their families left in agonizing suspense. The hostage crisis added a chilling new layer of complexity to an already volatile situation. It injected a deeply human element into the conflict, with the lives of innocent individuals hanging in the balance. The families of the hostages were thrust into a nightmare, clinging to hope while grappling with unimaginable fear and uncertainty. Israel vowed to do everything in its power to secure the release of its citizens. Negotiations, mediated by Egypt and other international actors, began almost immediately. However, talks proved difficult, with Hamas demanding the release of Palestinian prisoners held in Israeli jails in exchange for the hostages. The hostage crisis became a focal point of the conflict, with international pressure mounting on Hamas to release the captives. The United Nations, the United States, and European powers all condemned the hostage-taking and called for the unconditional release of all those held. The hostage crisis underscored the brutality of the conflict and the human toll exacted on both sides. After weeks of intense fighting, a ceasefire agreement brokered by Egypt was reached between Israel and Hamas. The ceasefire, which came into effect on February 10, 2025, brought a much-needed respite from the violence. However, it was a fragile truce, with both sides deeply distrustful of the other, and the underlying issues of the conflict remaining unresolved. The ceasefire agreement included provisions for the phased release of hostages held by Hamas, as well as the easing of the Israeli blockade on Gaza. Israel agreed to allow for the entry of humanitarian aid and essential goods into Gaza, which had been devastated by weeks of bombardment. While the ceasefire brought a welcome halt to the fighting, it did little to address the root causes of the conflict. The underlying issues of land, security, and recognition remained unresolved, leaving open the possibility of renewed violence in the future. The ceasefire was met with cautious optimism by the international community. The United Nations Security Council welcomed the truce and called on both sides to adhere to its terms. However, there was also recognition that the ceasefire was only a first step, and that a much more comprehensive and sustainable solution was needed to prevent further bloodshed. Section 5. The Weight of Diplomacy, International Actors and Mediators. The international community played a critical role in mediating the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. Egypt, in particular, played a central role, leveraging its relationships with both sides to facilitate dialogue and find common ground. Qatar also emerged as a key player, providing financial assistance to Gaza and using its influence to urge Hamas towards de-escalation. The United States, under the Biden administration, faced a delicate balancing act. The U.S. has long been a staunch ally of Israel, providing military and diplomatic support. However, the Biden administration also sought to engage with the Palestinian Authority and to press for a two-state solution to the conflict. The European Union, meanwhile, focused its efforts on providing humanitarian assistance to Gaza and on calling for a resumption of peace talks. The EU has been a major donor to the Palestinian Authority, providing financial support for essential services and infrastructure projects. The role of the international community in the Israel-Palestinian conflict has often been fraught with challenges. The conflict's intractability, coupled with the deep divisions within both Israeli and Palestinian societies, has made finding a lasting solution extremely difficult. However, the ceasefire demonstrated that diplomacy, while challenging, can yield results. The international community's continued engagement and support will be crucial in the months and years ahead as the parties seek a path towards a more peaceful future. Section 6. Life under siege: Gaza and the West Bank in crisis. The recent conflict exacted a heavy toll on civilians on both sides. However, the Gaza Strip, with its dense population and limited infrastructure, bore the brunt of the devastation. Weeks of Israeli airstrikes reduced entire neighborhoods to rubble, leaving thousands of Palestinians homeless and displaced. The humanitarian situation in Gaza was already dire before the recent conflict, but the fighting pushed the enclave to the brink of collapse. Hospitals were overwhelmed with casualties, essential supplies were scarce, and the infrastructure was severely damaged. The United Nations warned of a looming humanitarian catastrophe, with millions of Palestinians in desperate need of food, water, and medical care. In the West Bank, the situation was less dire, but tensions remained high. The Palestinian Authority, which governs parts of the West Bank, condemned the Israeli offensive in Gaza and called for international action to end the blockade. However, the Palestinian Authority's own legitimacy had been eroded in recent years, with many Palestinians disillusioned by its perceived corruption and ineffectiveness. The recent conflict exacerbated the already difficult living conditions for Palestinians in both Gaza and the West Bank. The conflict served as a stark reminder of the human cost of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the urgent need for a just and lasting solution. Section 7. The Trump Factor: a controversial role in the Middle East. The Trump administration's approach to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict marked a significant departure from previous U.S. policy. Trump, who had expressed strong pro-Israel sentiments during his campaign, took a number of steps that were seen as highly favorable to Israel and deeply damaging to the Palestinian cause. One of Trump's most consequential moves was to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and to move the U.S. embassy there from Tel Aviv. This decision, which reversed decades of U.S. policy, was met with widespread condemnation from the international community and sparked protests across the Palestinian territories. Trump also cut off funding to the Palestinian Authority and to UNRWA, the UN agency that provides assistance to Palestinian refugees. These cuts had a devastating impact on the Palestinian economy and on the lives of millions of Palestinians who rely on UNRWA for essential services. Trump's approach to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was widely criticized as being one-sided and counterproductive. Critics argued that his policies only served to further entrench the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and to make a two-state solution even more elusive. Section 8. Echoes of History, The Long Road to Peace. The roots of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict run deep, stretching back over a century. Understanding the historical context is crucial to grasping the complexities of the present situation. The conflict is not merely a border dispute as it is often portrayed, but a clash of narratives, identities, and aspirations. The Zionist movement, which emerged in the late 19th century, sought to establish a Jewish homeland in Palestine, then part of the Ottoman Empire. The Zionist movement was driven by a desire for Jewish self-determination after centuries of persecution and discrimination in Europe. However, Palestine was already inhabited by a large Arab population, which resisted the Zionist project and its implications for their own future. The British, who gained control of Palestine after World War I, issued the Balfour Declaration in 1917, expressing support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. This declaration, while vague in its wording, was seen by Zionists as a promise of a Jewish state, and by Palestinians as a betrayal of their own aspirations. The decades that followed were marked by growing tensions and violence between Jews and Arabs in Palestine. The British, unable to reconcile the competing claims, withdrew from Palestine in 1948, leaving the two sides to fight for control of the land. The 1948 Arab-Israeli War resulted in the creation of the State of Israel, but it also led to the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, an event known as the Nakba, or catastrophe. Section 9. Conclusion. A future uncertain. The ceasefire that went into effect in February 2025 brought a fragile peace to the region. However, the underlying issues that have fueled the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for decades remain unresolved. The future remains uncertain, with the possibility of renewed violence always looming. The international community faces a daunting challenge in trying to broker a lasting peace agreement. The two sides remain deeply divided with little trust between them. The recent conflict has only deepened the divisions and hardened the positions of both sides. A just and lasting solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict must address the core issues of the conflict, including the status of Jerusalem, the right of return for Palestinian refugees, and the issue of settlements. A two-state solution, with an independent Palestinian state alongside Israel, remains the most viable option, but it will require significant compromises from both sides. The human cost of this conflict has been immeasurable. Generations of Israelis and Palestinians have grown up in the shadow of violence and hatred. The international community has a moral obligation to work towards a peaceful resolution to this conflict, one that ensures the security and dignity of both Israelis and Palestinians. The path to peace will be long and arduous, but it is a journey that must be taken.